Okay, good morning. Our learning is Ila Nishmas Mendel, Mariam Bas Kalman Ruvain, her Neshama Shem and Aliyah. We are on the last words of Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph, and with the two dots. Amar Rabba Barabhuna, Kol Adam Sheyesh Bo Torah, Ve'ein Bo Yiras Shamayim. Anyone who has Torah but does not have the fear of heaven, Doma LeGizbar Shemasr Lo Maftechos Hapnimis. It's like someone who has like a treasurer who has keys for the inner place, maftechos hachitzonos lo masrlo b'hei ayel, but he doesn't have the keys to the outer chambers. How in the world is he going to get in? In other words, what we're saying over here is you have Torah. Torah is the inner connection to Hashem, but you don't have Yiras Shamayim, you don't have fear of heaven. You can't actually access it. In other words, without Yiras Shamayim, you have no way of really accessing the Torah, that the meaning, the depth of the Torah. Obviously, you can learn Torah. Anyone can learn Torah. So, someone who has no fear of heaven. But if you really want to have the impact of Torah, without Yiras Shamayim, you can't actually access the true impact of Torah. It's superficial. It's not, I remember my father once telling us that when he was visiting people he grew up in Israel, he was on Shabbos, he would go visit people in the hospital. This is back in the day when you're allowed to smoke in hospitals, because it was healthy. Basically, he comes he used to go on Shabbos, and he sees a guy sitting in the lobby smoking. Okay, fine, whatever, whatever. Okay, he grew up in Tel Aviv. He comes closer, and he sees the guy's learning Gemara. He says, "What are you doing?" He says, "What do you mean? It's a great book." He said, it wasn't like from a religious perspective whatsoever. It was a great book. It was something he enjoyed. It was, again, my father grew up right after the Holocaust. It was probably someone who grew up and, whatever, no judgments. But bottom line is that, without Yiras Shamayim, you can't really access the impact of it. Yeah, it is a great book. It's fascinating. We could spend our time intellectually engaging in this, but if you really want the impact of Torah, Yiras Shamayim is the gate. So you have the Torah, but you don't have the Yiras Shamayim. You can't really get to it. It's just, you have the knowledge, but the spiritual impact without Yiras Shamayim does not allow us to actually access the impact of Talmud Torah. Okay? Machar is Rav Yanai. Rav Yanai proclaims, Chaval adleis ledarta. Woe is to someone who does not own a courtyard, Vitar ledarta avid, but he makes for himself a gate for the courtyard. Okay? So what does this mean? So the way the Mepharshim understand this is that he's saying that he makes for himself a gate. The Torah here, it's actually almost the opposite. He's saying that he says, woe to a person who makes a gate. Imagine you made a door, but doesn't actually end up anywhere. So he's referring to someone who has Torah, but does not have Yiras Shamayim. So he has a doorway, but he doesn't have Yiras Shamayim. So over here, actually, the analogy is flipped. Over here, the Torah is the first thing; it's the doorway, but the Yiras Shamayim is inaccessible, beyond that. In other words, it seems like, right? In other words, he's saying, woe to someone who just has a doorway, but a doorway to nowhere is meaningless, right? So woe is to someone who just has Torah, but it doesn't actually take them anywhere. It doesn't actually move them anywhere further. So the Mefarshim, the Chasam Sofer, I believe it is, understands that there's like two levels to what's happening over here. In other words, there is Yiras Shamayim, which leads us to a basic level of Talmud Torah, but then there's Talmud Torah, which leads a person to a much deeper form of Yiras Shamayim. In other words, there's like a basic fear of heaven, I'm afraid of Hashem, but then there's a sense of awe, a sense of really understanding who God is, and therefore having a much deeper connection. So the first Manda Amar was saying, woe is to, that a person needs to have, you need to have some level of Yiras Shamayim in order to engage Torah on the most basic level. But then, through Talmud Torah, you're able to engage a deeper level of awe, of trepidation, of a sense of awe, like Yiras HaRomamus, right? There's Yiras HaOnesh, there's fear of heaven, just like afraid I'm going to hit by a lightning bolt, and then there's a sense of awe, like you sit in front of a painting, you sit on a mountaintop, and like, wow, I feel small in front of it. That is only accessed by a deeper level of Torah. So the second Manda Amar of Yanai is basically saying, yeah, sometimes a person has just the gate, the Torah, but it doesn't allow them, but it's a pity, because they don't use it to better their relationship with God, right? In other words, so Torah, on the one hand, Yira, a basic level of fear, is a prerequisite for connecting to Torah. I can't learn Torah if I'm sitting here smoking a cigarette on Shabbos. I'm not going to be able to really connect to God at all. But then, through the Torah, it's expected I'm supposed to have a much more profound understanding of who God is, and it's supposed to bring me to a place of a certain sense of awe of Hashem. And it's a pity if all I have is the Torah and not allow that to change my relationship with God. And that's the person that just has the gate, just has the doorway, but doesn't lead them to anything deeper, right? So a fear that precedes and is a prerequisite for Torah, but also there is a fear or an awe, rather, that Torah is supposed to lead me to. It's supposed to lead me to a deepened relationship with Hashem. Yeah? Okay? Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Lo Barak Kadosh Baruch Hu Olamo Ezer Lamo El Gedish Yiram Lefanav. Hashem created the world for us to stand in awe in front of Him. In other words, he's building up on what Rav Yanai said, that the goal of the entire world is we should stand in awe. Again, not in fear, but a sense of awe. Shenemar Velikim Asa Shirim Lefanav. Hashem made us so that we stand in front of Him in awe. In other words, an awe means that we have a relationship and where we feel a connection, but we ultimately feel overawed by Hashem. Okay, and so so the Gemara is just continuing the theme from yesterday about the importance of awe awe in our relation, in our avodas Hashem, and that theme is going to be continued over here. Rabbi Simon, Rabbi Lazar, have a Yosu, Chalav Azla, Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha, and Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha was walking by. Rabbi Shimon and Lazar were sitting together, and Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha walks by. One of them says to his friend, Neko Mekameh, let's stand up. Digvar Dechel Chatanhu. He's someone who fears sins. In other words, he's a person of awe, a person of fear. Let's stand up because he's a Torah scholar. Amrlei, the first one said, I said he's a person who fears sins. And then you say he's a Torah scholar. In other words, you're belittling it. In other words, fear of Hashem is much greater. In other words, I say, two of us are sitting together, and someone's walking by, and I say, wow, look at that person who fears Hashem. The other person says, look at that person who's Talmid Chacham. What are you doing? You're belittling him by saying he's Talmid Chacham. Fear of Hashem is actually greater, right? That was the counter. We could now the Gemara just said if Shimon and Elazar were sitting together and said one of them said it, one of them said this, one of them said that. It doesn't say who said what. Now the Gemara is saying it makes sense that Elazar was the one who said that it's a man who fears Hashem. Why? Because we have a teaching from Rabbi Yochanan from the name of Elazar. As Hashem. We could assume it's Rabbi Lazar because we have a teaching from Rabbi Lazar who emphasizes the importance of fear of Hashem. What's the teaching? The teaching is that Kadosh Baruch Hu says the only thing that Hashem has in this world is fear. Meaning the only thing Hashem wants in this world is fear. Shenemar, because the pasuk says, "V'ata Yisrael ma Hashem lakecha shalom eimach ki im liyiras Hashem." Moshe says to the Jewish people before his death, "What is the one thing Hashem wants from you? Only to fear Hashem." Uchsiv, and also similarly it says, "V'yomer la'adam hein yiras Hashem hi chachma." That it says the fear of Hashem. That is wisdom. Okay, use the word hain. Yavani karon la'achas hain. And it's just pointing out the word hain. It's not such a typical Hebrew word. We prove from the Greek language that the word hain means it is one and the same. So we see that yiras Hashem is one and the same with wisdom. What does it mean? It's one and the same with wisdom, and that it means that the purpose of all wisdom, the reason we're learning Torah right now, is not just as a nice spiritual exercise, but it's meant to instill within us an awe of Hashem. That's where Rabbi Lazar emphasizes. So we see these teachings from Rabbi Lazar where he emphasizes the fact that A, Yiras Hashem is like the highest level, and B, he says the whole purpose of Torah learning is so that we are able to develop within ourselves a certain awe of Hashem, and therefore, when we had this teaching a moment ago, we had this story, and Rabbi Lazar and Rav Shimon were sitting together, and one of them said, the fear of Hashem is great. Who was that? We could assume it's Rabbi Lazar because we have other places where Rabbi Lazar emphasizes Yiras Hashem. Yeah? Okay. Darash Rav Ula teaches the following. My dechsiv al tirsha harbe. This is an amazing memory. Okay, what is the meaning? There's a pasuk in Koheles which says, do not be like a big Russia. Do not be a big Russia, right? Everyone's a big Russia, right? Isn't that a song, a famous new song? Okay. So harbe hudzelo lirsha. The implication is, don't be a big Russia. Hama'at lirsha, right? It says, don't be a big Russia. But if you're a small Russia, then it's okay, right? That's ridiculous. Ella, rather, what's the teaching? Listen to this. Misha achal shum, v'reicho nodef. A person who eats garlic, and now their breath stinks, okay? Yachzer v'yochal shum, acher v'hei reicho nodef. Should a person go back and say, listen, since my breath smells already, and no one's going to want to talk to me, I may as well make my breath smell even worse and eat more garlic, right? And my breath will smell even worse. No, of course not, right? So what is that teaching us? What that's teaching us is such an important thing. I remember one of my teachers in a school which I did not graduate from saying the exact opposite, which was that he said that, once you make one mistake, forget it. You mess up, forget the whole thing. Which is like the most ridiculous thing you could possibly tell people, especially kids, but tell for adults as well, right? We do this to ourselves. I'm not going to blame this rabbi. We do this to ourselves. We say, since I messed up, since I'm not so great at this thing, therefore forget the whole thing. Maybe I speak a little Lashon Hara, I speak all Lashon Hara, forget it. I don't keep Lashon Hara. 612, right? No. And the point is that just because your breath smells, don't make it smell worse. Right? Just because you made one sin, don't keep on going down that path. We all make mistakes. But to then go ahead and say, well, since I already started doing some mistakes, I'm going to continue, that is not what Hashem wants. Every single act we do and act we don't do is incredibly precious. And that's what it means. Don't be a big rasha. Just because you made a small rishus. We're not talking about a chait, a mistake. You did something deliberate. You did something terrible. But don't throw the towel in. Don't throw the towel in. Shlomo Melech is telling us that hold on tight. Yeah, a person can make mistakes. A person made more than mistakes, person would sin deliberately, but to go ahead and just say, well, I'm done with X, Y, or Z, and therefore continue going down that path is a terrible mistake. Just because, you stink, make yourself stink even worse, no one's gonna, just because, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous, right? It doesn't make sense, and therefore a person should recognize the value of every mitzvah, the value of refraining from any avera. Don't lose sight of that. Okay. What is the meaning? Okay, so there's a pasuk in Tehillim which says that David HaMelech is lamenting the fact that Risham seem to have this easy death. right? We touched upon this earlier, that tzaddikim have a very hard time oftentimes in life, and Risham happens to seemingly have an easy time, right? There are no ties that bind them upon their death. What does that mean? That means that sometimes a person is in a lot of pain when they die. They have to hold them down because they're in so much pain. But for Risham, nothing holds them down. Their strength, to the end of their life, the strength is strong. So what's the meaning of this pasuk? Okay, so we're gonna learn. We're gonna darshan this word chartsubos in a bit of a homiletic way. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu l'dayin l'Risham she'enam charedim v'atzevim. The word chartsubos over here is seen as like a contraction of the words charedim v'atzevim. Not enough that the Risham are not afraid and are sad miyoma misa because of death. Ela shalibam bari lahem keulam. But their hearts are as big as a hall. Okay, so what does this mean? The way that the Gemara is understanding this, not just that Risham live their life without any pain, but we're talking about more emotional pain. Not enough that the Risham, they're not afraid of the day of death, but they're cool, they're chilled with it. They're completely fine, they're not afraid of death, meaning the day of death, meaning the day of judgment. They're completely at ease with the fact that they are doing something wrong. In other words, this is the Rasha. You know what the Rasha is? The Rasha is not the person who doesn't sin. The Rasha is the person who has no guilt. Guilt is, again, too much guilt could be dangerous, but some level of guilt, some level of trepidation, the fact that, oh my gosh, I messed up, it's going to come back and bite me, I'm afraid of the ultimate judgment day, that is the good. Over here we're seeing the inverse. You know what the Russia's fault is? You know what the Russia's issue is? Is the fact that there is no sadness, there's no fear, there's no sense of regret over anything they do. On the contrary, they feel completely at ease with all the mistakes that they make. That's the problem, right? They say, one of the Bali Musar says, my biggest success is when, even if the worst person in our yeshiva could go astray, could do the most terrible things, but my success is when they feel bad about it, right? Just having some level of regret. Charatz is the first step to tshuva, right? Just allowing ourselves to feel some level of charatz for doing something wrong, regret, that pushes us on the way. Okay. Similarly, this is a pasuk the pasuk says, this is their way, it is their foolishness. Okay, so what is the meaning of this? Yodim Risham Shadarkam Lamisa. Risham know that they're going to die. Okay, V'yeshlem Chelev Al Kislam, but they have fat on their loins, right? And it basically blinds them to their ultimate death. Shema Tomer Shicha Himehen. So someone may say, okay, so maybe they just are forgetting about the fact that there's a Yom Hadin, that there's a day of judgment, and therefore it's a shogeg. They can't be held accountable. Talon Bacharem Ifiyam Yir Tusela. But the end of that pasuk that we just quoted says that of their ultimate ending, their mouths speak. So in other words, they speak about the fact that they're going to die. They speak about the fact that that they're not going to be here forever. So they're not forget that they're going to die, and nonetheless they live their lives in an empty fashion and don't live their life with any purpose. And that again is the issue. So again, with these just to summarize, the last 3 Gemaras or the last 4 Gemaras, the Gemaras emphasize the importance of Yiras Hashem. The goal of Talmud Torah is we need some level of Yiras Shamayim in order to learn Torah. But then the goal of learning Torah is so that we have an awe of Hashem, so we have a deeper relationship with Hashem, right? And one of the ways we do that is we see the complexity of the Torah. Right? It's hard, it's complicated, right? But this is the way the Mefarshim understands that we are getting a little bit of an access to Hashem's wisdom through Talmud Torah. So, sometimes we feel overwhelmed by Gemara. At the very least, we can take away is to stand in awe in front of Hashem. This is Hashem's wisdom, and we should walk away for the deeper, more profound understanding of Hashem's Torah, and ultimately Hashem. That is the ultimate goal of what we're doing, to develop a deeper relationship with Hashem. When it comes to sin, we should, just because we made one sin, shouldn't mean we should double up and do more sins. And lastly, a way of a rasha is not to have any regret, which implies that the way of a good person is that, we may sin, but at least we should feel some regret after doing so. Okay? Fine. The Gemara concludes with just finishing up the last lines of the last Mishnah. Kechas alaner. If you recall the Mishnah we this whole thing started with was saying that if a person extinguishes a flame to spare, let's say a person has a candle on Shabbos and they blow the candle out because they want the oil for another time, right? What did the Mishnah say? Pater, you're exempt in that case. Okay? Sorry. Excuse me. Chayiv. Gemara says Mishnah said you're chayiv, and then Rav Yossi came along. Rav Yossi said you're pater. You're pater in those cases if you do it to save the oil or things like that. But if you do it to save the wick, you're going to be chayiv. Again, one more time. The Mishnah said if a person blows out a candle for the sake of, let's say, oil, then you're going to be chayav. Okay? And we established the Mishnah. Who is the author of the Mishnah? Rav Yehuda or Rav Shimon? Again, let's just quickly do a review. There is a discussion about davar malacha she'ina tzricha legufa. There is a malacha, in other words, malacha, when we think of, Rav Shimon understands that any malacha, in order to be liable for a malacha on Shabbos, it has to be done for a higher purpose. Rav Yehuda says, and that's called shetricha legufa. Rav Yehuda says, malacha she'ena tzricha legufa, you do a malacha not needed for a higher purpose, you're still going to be chayav. So again, I blow out a candle. right? Now I'm blowing out the candle. I'm not using it for a higher purpose. I'm using it because I want to save the oil for the future. In other words, I'm not creating something. When I create a cake, I put a bunch of ingredients and I'm creating something new. When I blow out a candle, right, and I do it because I want to use the oil for something at a later time, that act itself, there's nothing, I'm not creating something new. I'm doing it because I want to save this thing for something in the future, right? You see that that's not like a higher purpose? You see how that could be construed as not a higher purpose? That's called a malacha she'en shricha legufa. Rav Shimon says in that case, you're exempt. Because I'm not blowing it out for a higher purpose. I'm blowing it because I just want to save it. I just want to stop what it's doing right now. It's it's similar to a person has something smelly in their house. They're bringing it outside. It's not that I want the item outside. I just don't want it here, right? So if I want the item outside, that's malacha shetzrich legufa. I'm doing it for, so to speak, a more constructive purpose. If I just don't want it here, and I'm moving it from Rishus Yachid to Rishus Rabbim, that's malacha she'eino tzrich legufa. Rav Yehuda says you're chayiv in such a case. Rav Shimon says you're patur. So our Mishnah, which said you blew out the candle for the purpose of saving it, so it's not making it for a higher purpose. Therefore, Rav Shimon would say you're exempt. And the author, the Tanna Kama of Rav Mishnah, was Rav Yehuda. But then Rav Yossi came along and said something in between. He said, if I'm blowing it out to save oil, exempt. If I'm blowing it out to save the wick, I'm going to be chayav. And now the Gemara is going to say, where's Rav Yossi land? Is he in the Rav Yehuda camp? Is he in the Rav Shimon camp? His opinion doesn't seem to match up so well. That's what the Gemara is asking, okay? Chaim and Pater from Chatas, correct. Yeah. Rav Yossi command Svirle. Rav Yossi, whose view does he go like? Ik Rav Yehuda Svirle. If he holds like Rav Yehuda, then even when he blows it out to save the oil, that's a malacha shem shrich legufa, which Yehuda holds your chayav for. V'ik Rav Shimon Svirle. If you hold like Rav Shimon, psila nami liftar. According to Rav Shimon, you should also be exempt because Rav Shimon says unless it's being done for a higher purpose, you are going to be pater. And therefore, where does Rav Yossi land? So Amar Ula L'Olam Rav Yehuda Svirle really holds like Rav Yehuda. However, he also holds of something else. Because Rav Yossi, Sosam nas livnos b'mkomo have a soser. Amnos livnos shelo b'mkomo lo have a soser. Okay, so he comes and teaches us the following principle about bona. Bona means to build something. Okay, so typically, if a person builds something, if a person destroys something, let's say I have a house, and a person goes ahead and just destroys the house because they don't want the house. They don't plan on doing anything in that place. They just don't want the house. Okay, that's called soser. That's called destroying. Okay, maybe that's a very extreme example. Whatever, I have a table over here, right? And I break the table. And I do it because I just don't want this table. I'm breaking it. That's called soser, and you are not going to be chayav over there. But let's say I break this table because it wasn't made very well, and I want to redo it, right? I break it, manas livnos. I break the table in order to rebuild it. That is a constructive act, and I would be chayav for such a thing, right? But comes along Rav Yossi and gives another and gives a caveat to that and qualifies it. He says, when we say, let's go back to the house structure because it's something in its place. Let's say a person has a small house that a shed, let's say, and they want to break it in order to rebuild. He says it depends. If I'm breaking it to rebuild in the place that it's in right now, that's constructive. If I break it to rebuild by, a few blocks over, then that's not called constructive. Right? When it has to be a inherently constructive act. So I could destroy it to rebuild in its place. Okay? So he holds, and that's a chiddush. That's a novel idea that he's suggesting. And when I break something in order to rebuild, it's only considered constructive if I'm going to rebuild it in its same place that I destroyed it. Okay? Now, how does that apply to a wick? How does it apply to a candle? So he says like this: when I blow out a candle, okay, so what's the place of a fire? What's the place of a fire? Is it the lamp? The way Rav Yossi is explaining it is the wick is the place. That's where the fire actually exists. That's the place of the fire. So when I blow out the candle because I want to save the oil, I don't care about the wick. The wick I'm going to get rid of. I'm going to go ahead, I blow out the candle, and then I'm going to put a new wick later on. So that is destroying in order to rebuild in a new place because I'm going to use a new wick. And therefore, in that case, Rav Yossi would say, yes, I hold like Rav Yehuda. I don't need to be a higher purpose, but I'm rebuilding, I'm destroying, i.e. blowing it out. In order to rebuild, i.e. light again. But it's in a new place because I'm going to use a new wick. And therefore he'll say I'm exempt. But when I'm blowing out the wick and I plan on using that same wick, that is destroying for the sake of rebuilding in the same place because I'm using the same wick. And therefore that's why Rav Yossi said that only in that case are you going to be chayav, right? Okay. Amrle Rabba Mikti. He said, Rabba questions this. He says, Kol malachos yalfina lahu, all the laws we learn from the Mishkan, right? All the source of all malachos from the Mishkan. V'hasam sosham nas livno shalobim kamahu. He says every single case of the Mishkan. Think about it. What do they do in the desert? They took it down. They took it apart, right? And then the reason they took it apart was to rebuild. Yes. But where did they rebuild? In the same place? Never. They were constantly traveling. So they would take it away and rebuild somewhere else. So he says if the whole prototype of Malacha is the Mishkan, and therefore, in order to be chayav, you have to be sosra manas livnos. Again, in the Mishkan, when they took down the walls of the Mishkan, they took down everything, it was taking it down to rebuild. That's fine. But it was never in the same place. They would take it down and then travel and rebuild somewhere else. So how could you come along and say the only time you're going to be chayav is when I destroy and rebuild in its place? That's the kind of time I'm chayav. It's not true. Because in the Mishkan, the prototype, the source of this whole thing is taking something down and rebuilding somewhere else. Yeah? So Amrle, he says an interesting answer. He says, Shani Hasam. It's different. He says, since their entire traveling around was by the word of Hashem, it's like it's built in that same place. In other words, what's going on over here? What's going on over here is as follows. What's the rationale to say, what's the svara to say that when a person destroys something to rebuild somewhere else, that it's not considered a constructive act? The reason is because they're seen as like two separate things. Again, I have my shed. I destroy my shed, and then I build it somewhere else. There's nothing really connecting that act of destruction directly to the rebuilding, since I moved it somewhere else. Whereas when I destroy it and rebuild it in its own place, it's all one thing. Right? But over here, since everything is ordained by God, the only way they traveled was because Hashem said to travel. Therefore, there's some connecting bond, connecting all of the destroying and rebuilding. In other words, it's not so much about place. Place is just an application of the concept. The concept is that there has to be a connection between the destroying and the rebuilding. When I do it in its own place, it's connected. When I move it somewhere else, it's not connected. Unless every single thing I'm doing is because Hashem's telling me to do so. Then there is this glue, this rubber band, that's connecting my destroying over here, taking down the Mishkan over here, to somewhere else, right? So he's saying, don't bring me a kasha from the Mishnah, from the Mishkan, because in the Mishkan, there is enough of a bond between the taking down in place A and the rebuilding in place B. Whereas when you and I take something down, there's not enough of a connection between the two places. And therefore he says, you can't bring me a kasha in the Mishkan, because the Mishkan, there it's different, everything is ordained by Hashem. But in a scenario where it's not ordained by Hashem, I need something else to connect it to the act of destruction, has to be in its own place. If you move it somewhere else, it's a separate thing, and therefore you'll not be chayav for your destruction. Okay? That's answer number one. Okay? A little bit of a profound answer. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees in the interpretation of the Mishnah. He says, L'olam, Rav Shimon Svirle. Really, this is like the opinion of Rav Shimon. He says Rav Yossi really holds like Rav Shimon. Okay, in which case you should be patur for every. We understand why he says you're exempt for everything, but why does he hold by the psila, by the wick, that you're chayav? Umaisha psila. Why does he hold that you are chayav for the wick when you blow it out for the sake of the wick? We're talking about a wick that needs to be singed. It needs to be singed in order to be used. In other words, some wicks, the only way they can be used is if they're already burnt a little bit. If they're not burnt a little bit, you will not be able to use them. Right? There, even Rav Shimon would agree. In other words, what's Rav Shimon's opinion? Davar she'en shicha legufa, you're a patur for. If it's not for a higher purpose, you're exempt. But if the purpose of this, I put the wick on, and then I blow it out. So now I can have a wick that is usable. Right? So when I blow it out, that's already a constructive purpose. Even Rav Shimon would agree to that case. And therefore, Rav Shimon, we're saying really this goes like Rav Shimon. Rava comes along and says, Daikanam Tani, the Mishnah itself, the terminology it uses proves like Rav Shimon. Because what does the Mishnah say? The reason you're chayav, or the reason Rav Yossi says you're chayav by blowing out the wick is shu osa pecham, because it makes the wick into charcoal. It doesn't say because it's usable, because it's already made into charcoal, meaning it's already singed, but rather it says the reason you're chayav by the psila is because you're making it into something which is now charcoal, meaning you're making it into something. Shema mina. That implies, it says very clearly, it's going like Rav Shimon. Again, Rav Shimon says the reason, within the view of Rav Shimon, the reason you would be chayav is because you're making it into something greater. That's called a malacha shetzricha legufa. And therefore, if Yossi, who says that you're chayav by the wick, it makes sense to say it goes like Rav Shimon. And the Mishnah seems like it's going Rav Shimon because it says the reason you're chayav is because it makes it into something greater, i.e. a wick, i.e. i.e. charcoal, i.e. now a usable wick, and therefore we go with that approach, saying that the Mishnah is actually going like Rav Shimon and Rav Yehuda. Let's just read the Mishnah, and then we'll stop over here. Al shlosha dvarim nashim meis b'shas lidasan. Okay, very heavy Mishnah. The Mishnah says 3 transgressions could cause a woman to die in childbirth. That was obviously much more common back in the day. What are the 3 things? Al she'enan zihirus ben nida. If they're not careful regarding the laws of nida, bechala, with hafrashas chala, taking away chala, v'lakas ner, or the lighting of Shabbos candles. And we're going to unpack this Mishnah, God willing, tomorrow. Have a great day.